In this interactive video, we're going to survey some of the most influential and popular ideas of Nietzsche across several of his works. And before we do that, a note on this painting. What you can see here, is a man who's supposed to be beating his horse and Nietzsche coming in between the two. And I think that the video that we start off, that will kick off in a second, will discuss this legend or story or tale or account. But if it doesn't, you should look up really quickly. Google Nietzsche and horse and Turin, Turin, and read this incredible, very moving story. But with no further ado, wait. Okay, I think I fixed that and stopped recording for a second. Okay.
The challenge begins with how to pronounce his name. The first bit should sound like ni, the second like cha, Nietzsche. Then we need to get past some of his extraordinary and provocative statements. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. God is dead, and we have killed him. And his large moustache. But when we do, we'll discover a thinker who's intermittently enchanting, wise, and very helpful. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in a quiet village in the eastern part of Germany, where his father was the priest. He did exceptionally well at school and university, and so excelled at ancient Greek that he was made a professor at the University of Basel when still only in his mid-20s. But his official career didn't work out. He got fed up with his fellow academics, gave up his job, and moved to Sils Maria in the Swiss Alps, where he lived quietly, working on his masterpieces, among them The Birth of Tragedy, Human All Too Human, The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals. He had lots of problems. He didn't get on with his family. I don't like my mother, and it's painful even for me to hear my sister's voice. Women kept rejecting him. His books didn't sell. And when he was only 44, he had a mental breakdown, precipitated when he saw a horse in a Turin street being beaten by its driver, and ran over to embrace him, shouting, "I understand you." He never recovered and died 11 sad years later. But his philosophy was full of heroism and grandeur. He was a prophet of what he called Selbstüberwindung, or self-overcoming, the process by which a great-souled person, what he called an Ubermench, rises above their circumstances and difficulties to embrace whatever life throws at them. He wanted his work to teach us, as he put it, how to become who we really are. His thought centers around 4 main recommendations. 1. Own up to envy. Envy is, Nietzsche recognized, a big part of life. Yet the lingering effects of Christianity generally teach us to feel ashamed of our envious feelings. They seem an indication of evil, so we hide them from ourselves and others. Yet there's nothing wrong with envy, maintained Nietzsche, so long as we use it as a guide to what we really want. Every person who makes us envious should be seen as an indication of what we could one day become. The envy-inducing writer, tycoon, or chef is hinting at who you are capable of one day being. It's not that Nietzsche believed we always end up getting what we want. His own life had taught him this well enough. He simply insisted that we must face up to our true desires, put up a heroic fight to honour them, and only then mourn failure with solemn dignity. That is what it means to be an Ubermensch. 2. Don't be a Christian. Nietzsche had some extreme things to say about Christianity. In the entire New Testament, he wrote, there is only one person worth respecting, Pilate, the Roman governor. It was knockabout stuff, but his true target was more subtle and more interesting. He resented Christianity for protecting people from their envy. Christianity had, in Nietzsche's account, emerged in the late Roman Empire, in the minds of timid slaves who'd lacked the stomach to get hold of what they really wanted, and so had clung to a philosophy that made a virtue of their cowardice. He called this Sklavenmoral. Christians, whom he rather rudely termed die Herde, the herd, had wished to enjoy the real ingredients of fulfillment, a position in the world, sex, intellectual mastery, creativity, but they'd been too inept to get them. They'd therefore fashioned a hypocritical creed, denouncing what they wanted but were too weak to fight for, while praising what they didn't want but happened to have. So, in the Christian value system, sexlessness turned into purity, weakness became goodness, submission to people one hates became obedience, and, in Nietzsche's phrase, not being able to take revenge turned into forgiveness. Christianity amounted to a giant machine for bitter denial. 3. Never drink alcohol. Nietzsche himself drank only water, and as a special treat, milk, and he thought we should do likewise. He wasn't making a small, eccentric dietary point. The idea went to the heart of his philosophy, as contained in his declaration, "There have been two great narcotics in European civilization, Christianity and alcohol." He hated alcohol for the very same reasons that he scorned Christianity, because both numb pain, both reassure us that things are just fine as they are, sapping us of the will to change our lives for the better. A few drinks usher in a transient feeling of satisfaction that can get fatally in the way of taking the steps necessary to improve our lives. Nietzsche was obsessed with the awkward truth that getting really valuable things done hurts. "How little you know of human happiness, you comfortable people," he wrote. "The secret of a fulfilled life is live dangerously, build your cities on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius." 4. God is dead. Nietzsche's dramatic assertion that God is dead is not, as it's often taken to be, some kind of a celebratory statement. Despite his reservations about Christianity, Nietzsche didn't think that the end of belief was anything to cheer about. Religious beliefs were false, he knew, but he observed that they were very, very beneficial in the sense of helping us cope with the problems of life. Nietzsche felt that the gap left by religion should ideally be filled by culture. He meant philosophy, art, music, literature. Culture should replace scripture. However, Nietzsche was deeply suspicious of the way his own era was handling culture. He believed the universities were killing the humanities, turning them into dry academic exercises, rather than using them for what they were always meant to be, guides to life. He admired the way the Greeks had used tragic drama in a practical, therapeutic way, as an occasion for catharsis and moral education, and wished his own age to be comparably ambitious. He called for a reformation in which people, newly conscious of the crisis brought on by the end of faith, would fill the gaps created by the disappearance of religion with philosophy and art. Every era faces particular psychological challenges, thought Nietzsche, and it's the task of the philosopher to identify and help solve these. For Nietzsche, the 19th century was reeling under the impact of two developments, mass democracy and atheism. The first threatened to unleash torrents of undigested envy, the second to leave humans without guidance or morality. In relation to both challenges, Nietzsche remains our endearing, fascinating, often lovable, and mustachioed guide.
Okay, so the horse story was in there. So, Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher and cultural critic, who published intensively in the 1870s and 1880s. He was famous for uncompromising criticisms of traditional European morality and religion, and also of conventional philosophical ideas and social and political pieties associated with modernity and increasing levels of and dependences upon technology. So many of these criticisms rely on psychological diagnoses that explore false consciousness infecting people's received ideas, sort of ideas that you don't ask for, they just happen to be there. You soak them up from your environment throughout your life. For that reason, he's often associated with a group of late modern thinkers like Marx and Freud, who advanced a hermeneutics of suspicion against traditional values. If you are philosophy majors or if you continue to study philosophy, this phrase will pop up again if it hasn't already. Some of his works include The Birth of Tragedy, Untimely Meditations, Human All Too Human, and the rest of these here. So again, we're taking a tour of some of his bigger ideas, but in general, and in his day, Nietzsche's works were treated as part of this influential philosophical movement known as life philosophy. And He was grouped with Henri Bergson and William Dilthey in this life philosophical movement. And this movement started from the assumption that philosophy had become excessively technical, abstract, and had lost its way. This has been our narrative since the beginning of this course, right? Um, Philosophy's point of origin, where its starting point, they argued, must be the concrete reality of life as it's actually lived. Existentialism, although the term hadn't come out yet at this point. Also, life philosophy criticizes the view of the self as the Cartesian knowing subject in the traditional theories of knowledge, that we're all these knowing, perceiving subjects over and against a world of objects, and it's part of the subject object distinction. That was another major target of life philosophy, and Nietzsche's in particular. And it's a good quote that I like from Dilthey: no real blood flows in the veins of the knowing subject. In other words, any philosophy that's starting off from this point is not of flesh and blood and doesn't help us understand the big question, which is how to live. So here's a very influential idea from Nietzsche's earlier career, the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And he introduced these terms in his work from 1872 called The Birth of Tragedy. And they're terms that are intended to designate the two central principles in ancient Greek culture. This was his argument, right? That the ancient Greeks lived according to the Apollonian versus the Dionysian, or Apollo the god and Dionysus the god, right? So the Apollonian is the basis of all analytic distinctions. Everything that is part of the unique individuality of man or thing is supposed to be Apollonian in character. All types of form or structure are Apollonian, since form serves to define or individualize that which is formed. Now that's a big mouthful there, but the Apollonian principle is meant to be the individuating principle, the principle of stark delineations, corners, like pinning something down and taking it apart and studying every little aspect of it, right? And some qualities or principles behind this principle: reason, control, stability, clarity, form. And Nietzsche said, for instance, sculpture is the most Apollonian of the arts, because you're taking this, lump of clay or whatever, marble or whatever it is that you're making your statue out of, and cutting away what's unnecessary and carving it up and making it clear and concise and bringing something into human control, right? But then there's what he called the Dionysian principle, total opposite of the Apollonian. Drunkenness and madness are Dionysian because they break down a human being's individual character. All forms of enthusiasm and ecstasy are Dionysian. And in all states, those such states, man or humans give up their individuality and submerge themselves in a greater whole. It's like a letting go, right? So the principles are, or the qualities are feeling as opposed to reason, drunkenness. And by drunkenness, it doesn't necessarily mean alcohol, or even drugs for that matter, just getting stupid, right? Rather than control. Flux, rather than stability, undifferentiated totality versus clarity and form, right? So, like the primordial, uh, ever changing flux is Dionysian, and then the stuff that carves it up is Apollonian. And he said that it's these two fundamental principles that give birth to art and culture. It's a really interesting book, one of his first. And he says that music is the most Dionysian of the arts. And further, he believed that art is produced as a result of the tension between these two, between reason and imagination. And so we all have the Apollonian and the Dionysian in us. And when they are in acute tension with one another, it gives birth to art. And now on Romanticism, meaning the period in history known as the Romantic period. In the preface to The Gay Science, that's the name of the book, 1887, he said that he has recovered from a debilitating illness he was suffering from when he wrote that Birth of Tragedy stuff. He was always reflecting on his earlier works. He wasn't trying to build a coherent system built from deductive logic. He was constantly changing his ideas and reflecting upon them and casting them aside and giving birth to new ones. So he said, when I wrote this book, I was suffering from a debilitating illness. And it's the nausea that had gradually grown out of a careless and pampering spiritual diet known as Romanticism. And what's unhealthy about Romanticism, he claims, is its nostalgic longing for a bygone golden age where people were still in touch with their primordial origin. He called it the ground of being. So the Romantic period in history is known as a reaction against the Enlightenment period, the age of reason, where reason had taken over essentially. And then there's this period of history where people are saying, gosh, it's so dry and clinical in this age of reason. I wish we could go back to the golden age where everything was more of a unity and a totality and more primordial, right? And he says this is unhealthy, this longing for this bygone era. And that by glorifying an imagined time of origins, Romanticism spawns the kind of yearning for the good old days that cuts people off from a healthy concern for the future by acting in the here and now. And further, when the past is used as a stick, like to beat the present, the result is a gloomy view of both the current world and the prospects for the future. Think about any elderly person that you know that because and you can see this play out, who longs for the good old days and can't stand the people of today. I mean, what do you essentially when they take this attitude, which is understandable sometimes, but apply this slide, for instance, to that sort of person who's like, oh, I remember when things were so good, the good old days. We should go back to the good old days. And look what it's essentially saying about the present. First, it's saying the present sucks. All of you people in the present suck, and it only is going to get suckier, to put it in just street language, right? I mean, effectively, I think that's what bothers a lot of us when we hear that sort of talk. But he's calling it Romanticism as a period in history and any particular romantic outlook on the past. A new kind of science he was proposing. So in the gay science also, his emphasis is on the present and the prospects for the future. It follows, right? Where the birth of tragedy had treated life as a deep, dark current beneath the surface play of appearances, right? The Apollonian and the Dionysian are this kind of deep current running through everything that boom comes up with art and boom comes up with culture and etc. He thought this was just a romantic notion. He says he now treats the very notion of opposition of that sort between surface appearance and concealed reality as itself the main source of sickness. This sort of Platonic dualism, what is truly real and what is just appearance, right? Or the immaterial and the material of Descartes, or call it thought and extension, these sorts of oppositions and dualisms. He said, this is the source of our ongoing sickness. And in the gay science further, it as a whole, it's a rejection of the teleological meta-narratives. That's a big mouthful again. Teleological means concerned with goals or purposes, right? And meta-narrative means something that's underlying any given narrative and gives birth to the narrative, right? He's saying, look, any stories we tell ourselves have these sort of teleological underpinnings, and they run through the history of Western thought, like this one. Once we were in a garden, but then we sinned, and now we're falling from grace. But there is a promise that we can be saved and return to the garden if we only do X, Y, and Z and we'll reach our purpose of returning to the garden, hence the teleological or the telos of returning to the garden, right? We all know this story. Take it out of the Bible's context. Once we were spontaneous and childlike and free, but then society came along and distorted our nature. But we can achieve a better kind of society where we can again be childlike and free. Again, you see this sort of teleological opposition and romanticism here. This is more like Freud. Or once we were altruistic and communal, but then along came capitalism and we became alienated from each other. But one day we can create a society that is classless and fulfilling. This is Marx's meta-narrative. Or, something that might come up today. Once people had initiative and took responsibility, but then along came the liberals and welfare and taxes, and now the world's a mess. But there is still hope. Just to kind of bring it into the modern. You can bring it into the modern any way you want to, as long as it follows this sort of pattern. He's rejecting this type of story, and he's saying it's the source of a major cultural malaise or sickness. And it's here that marks the first occurrences of Nietzsche's notions of the death of God and the eternal recurrence of the same. And those are two very influential and famous ideas of Nietzsche's that we'll treat in turn here. So, the death of God. So the essence of this notion is to undermine traditional, again, teleological narratives and the dualistic oppositions they presuppose. How come? Well, because these make sense only on the assumption that there is something genuinely worth striving for that is superior to the way things are in the present. It involves also ranking things into better and worse. That assumes the existence of standards and values that are transcendent and objective, as opposed to just being transient products of human feeling or practice, right? It's essentially saying there is a source outside of us that determines all right and wrong, be it God, be it absolute reason, uh, be it just absolutism, period. And we're trying to climb our way through the mud to get there. And then we judge everything according to this transcendent standard that never existed. So here's a quote from, we're still in the gay science here, the character called the Madman. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. What are these churches anymore if not the crypts and catacombs of God? So the death of God really means the death of absolutes, whatever we may name them. Again, God, um, absolute spirit, reason, science, when you treat science like a god, the cosmos, the universe, right? Noumena for Kant, Geist, humanity, history, all are nothing more than conceptual manifestations of our cravings for metaphysical comfort and must be destroyed, Nietzsche said. That any time we're thinking, oh, the universe has a plan for us, or God has a plan for us, or science has a plan, science in itself, not the scientists, have a plan for itself, or it's all going according to plan, or things will be the way that, any of those sorts of sayings. He says these are all our clumsy cravings and graspings for metaphysical comfort, and they don't exist. They're tales that we tell ourselves along the way because of how incredibly unnerving the truth is, which for Nietzsche, there is nothing more than what's here and now. What results from this destruction is a stage of reactive transitional nihilism that must be lived in and endured until it can be positively appropriated and used as a basis for creating a new form of cultural life. That's also what he called weightlessness. So this is a trip to me, and this makes me want to. I haven't read The Gay Science in its entirety in a while. But man, if this doesn't hit him, it hit me in a soft place, especially right now. He's saying once we start to really destroy our blind faith in all of these quote unquote transcendental sources of our values, we're going to have a kind of reactive, transitional. We as a species will go through this reactive transitional state of nihilism that's going to be painful. We're not going to know which way is up, which way is down, who's good, bad, indifferent, and what those things even are. All of our past assurances and all of that terra firma we used to, that, firm ground that we used to stand on as a species is crumbled, and our species is going to go through a really rough time, right? Until it can be positively appropriated and used as a basis for making a new form of cultural life. So if you happen to catch yourself, if you happen to be born during this transitional nihilism, and when I was preparing this lecture, I was like, man, this sounds a lot like today. But if you happen to be born in this period and it doesn't just last one lifetime, it's probably a long period, you got to grin and bear it and help prepare the way for this new form of cultural life. This is what Nietzsche said. I'm simply saying that this struck a chord in me today. You don't have to believe it. We're studying Nietzsche, right? So since we're mentioning nihilism, the term etymologically seems to have been coined in 19th century Russia as an expression of anarchy and revolutionary political opposition to the established order. So we're thinking the overturning of, monarchies and czars, correct? And Bolshevik revolution, right? That, hey, there's no anarchy. Is think of like hierarchy, right? Like, and the king and queen are at the tie. Think of a feudal order, right? And with the king or and queen or the king at the top, and then the lords, and then it goes down in that hierarchical pyramid, right? Anarchy means the taking away of that. It doesn't mean everybody's running around with no pants on and scratching each other's eyes out. I don't know why. It's not absolute orderlessness. It's a lack of that is where the word came from, right? But since then, it's come to mean a much broader kind of opposition, namely the denial of value, meaning, or even truth in the world. Essentially, it's come to mean that value itself has been annihilated, meaning has been annihilated, truth has been annihilated. So, further, it can be called the most extreme negative consequence of the contemporary critique and or collapse of traditional Western belief systems, which in various ways had maintained that, again, this is our class theme, right? That values have some kind of objective validity and justification. Um, that is being annihilated. Nietzsche argues human existence has an ultimate meaning or purpose, becoming annihilated, he argues, and that there are objective, knowable truths about the world that are timeless. That too, he argued, that notion is becoming annihilated. So when you hear people call Nietzsche a nihilist, this is kind of what it means. So the strongest aggregate assertion of nihilism would then be the world itself possesses no value, human existence is ultimately meaningless, and knowledge claims are without foundation. Everything's crumbled, and we are in this period of nihilism. Nietzsche argued that he was witnessing the beginnings of that period, and he actually was trying to help usher it in at certain times in his life and work. Next idea is the idea of the eternal recurrence. Just as a reminder, we're just hitting the big ideas, right? If you mention to anybody with a passing, who's taken some philosophy courses and read Nietzsche, they'll say, oh yeah, death of God, eternal recurrence, Dionysian, Apollonian. So that's just what we're taking on here. So this idea was introduced in the Gay Science, again, in a section called The Heaviest Weight, and can be thought of as Nietzsche's antidote to the sense of weightlessness that results from the death of God, what we just talked about. So the idea of eternal recurrence was an ancient Stoic doctrine which held that a finite number of elements governed by a fixed number of necessary conditions will, over an infinite amount of time, repeat the same patterns over and over again. Would be given these conditions, right? Can almost think of it as like the law of conservation of energy in its earliest expression, right? We've got infinite time and a fixed amount of energy, then the same patterns and configurations will happen again and may have have happened again. Eternal recurrence. This also sounds like it sounds like karma to me. So Nietzsche presents this as a hypothesis rather than an objective fact. And this is something important here. And here's a quote. What if one day or night a demon said to you, This life, as you live it now, and as you have lived it, you will have to live it once more and countless times more, and there will be nothing new about it, and everything unspeakably small and great in your life must come back to you, and all in the same series and sequence. If that thought took control of you, it would change you as you are, and maybe shatter you. Shatter you as you are. Now, if you actually could, instead of just saying, yeah, I understand what these words mean, right? Subject, verb, predicate, and I get it, and I can put it in my own words and paraphrase it. He means if you let this idea sink into your bones, it could shatter you, but shatter you for the better. Why? Because it would undermine any sense of teleology. Because it would undermine any sense of teleology in life. Further, what's the point? But by surviving this shattering thought, you'd be transformed. So, in other words, it would come in stages. If you let this idea really sit in your bones, when have you ever just been, it's kind of like that feeling from the Kierkegaard lecture, where you're standing on the cliff, right? And goes, and you, and people equate that with, fear of heights, right? And you get those butterflies in your stomach and you suck your breath. And like sometimes ideas can do that too. If you let this idea do that to you, first it would take away any sense of purpose you have in your life. What's the point of this, right? But if you could get through this incredible shattering, you'd be transformed. Facing up to the thought of eternal recurrence might impart a new and greater weightiness to your life, because it could lead you to ask this question in each and everything. Do you will or want, or could you will this once more and countless times more? This question would lie as the heaviest weight upon your acts. It would inform everything that you did. Once this sunk in to your molecules, when you're about to make any sort of decision, would I want to live this again? He said it would serve as the ultimate existential lighthouse. Hey, Twilight of the Idols, part of your readings, written at the very end of Nietzsche's productive life. It's subtitled How to Philosophize with a Hammer. So he's saying everything we use Twilight of the Idols, think what a cool, I mean, of course it's a translation, but it's a cool translation. It's like saying, good night, all of you idols that used to basically control our thoughts and lives and decisions, right? They're going bye-bye. It's the twilight of the idols. And then how to philosophize with a hammer. And he's like, and I'm here to help. I'm going to start breaking all that crap down so that I can help expedite this new sort of life that we're supposed to live after we shed that old skin. So it's a presentation of his mature thoughts in a compressed form. And it suggests that many of the concepts central to Western thought have turned out to be these hollow idols it would be in our service to discard, right? That's the theme. So it begins with a startling critique of Socrates. And it's startling because, Socrates is considered such a philosophical hero. And in to even criticize Socrates in the manner in which he does is it's almost sacrilege in philosophy. So rather than thinking of Socrates as the apex of Greek rationality and culture, What if we thought of him as a symptom of decadence and decline, in contrast to the great heroic Greeks described by Homer? He suggests. Looked at in this way, Socrates' glorification of reason would be a kind of sour grapes, the response of a misfit, who, unable to measure up to the Greek ideals of beauty and strength, tries to look better than others by claiming he has something special that no one else has. So to unpack this a bit, you can also read in many ancient Greek works that Socrates, they still describe Socrates as ugly and weird. Not just weird because of he was doing something so unusual in ancient Athens, but just off-putting and, again, ugly and a misfit. And so what Nietzsche is saying is that instead of looking at him as, look at this noble creature who came in and showed the ancient Athenians the error of their ways, what if we looked at him as this type of, ugly loser guy who knew that he could not measure up to the ancient Greeks' ideals of beauty and strength. So he tries to make himself look better by bringing other people down with reason. So it's a really interesting take on Socrates. You draw your own conclusions. So from this point of view, dialectic, or that Socratic method, that back and forth, is just the pathetic rationalization of a loser who is too weak to stand up for his own views, and the fascination with reason is the sign of an unhealthy person who is unable to satisfy his normal, healthy drives. Interesting interpretation, I'll say that once again. Draw your own conclusions. Oh, I couldn't help myself. Hammer time. Now, another very influential notion or concept is of Nietzsche's is perspectivism. And I believe that Nietzsche used that term himself, like, here's my new idea, we're going to call it perspectivism, let's throw it in the journals. It's what Nietzsche scholars came to call it. Again, Nietzsche claims that the old notions of God, reality, order, the good, the true, the beautiful have all turned out to be social constructions invented by people to try and satisfy their cravings for metaphysical comfort, right? In order to demonstrate the contingent or dependent nature of these dogmas, he traces their lineages, all of which turn out to be cultural interpretations. He does this with Christianity, morality, like in the genealogy of morals and beyond good and evil. He does this with consciousness, the concept of the self. And this perspectivism holds that our shared heritage has created us in such a way that we will encounter the world through a specific range of possible perspectives, all of which we can shift between. There's a quote from On the Genealogy of Morals. Particularly as knowers, let us not be ungrateful towards such resolute reversals of the familiar perspectives and valuations with which the spirit has raged against itself all too long. To see differently in this way for once, to want to see differently, is no small discipline and preparation of the intellect for its future objectivity, the latter understood not as disinterested contemplation, which he says is a non-concept and absurdity, but rather as the capacity to have one's pro and contra in one's power, and to shift them in and out so that one knows how to make precisely the difference in perspectives and affective interpretations useful for knowledge. Phew! I couldn't even get that out. But notice this pro and contra, right? Have it all in your power. You know what he's predicting here, in a sense, is Simone de Beauvoir's um, ambiguity. Learn how to live in ambiguity, he is saying. Sometimes you are going to see things one way. Sometimes you will see them another. Sometimes you'll hold two entirely contradictory opinions or beliefs or pieces of knowledge. Hold them. Don't say, "Ooh, if I believe this one, I can't believe that. And if I believe that," it's not an either or. Hold them in your power and allow them to shift in and out according to the circumstances. Let that happen. It will happen. You will hone your capability for interpretation. Right? Think ambiguity, where you're like, I don't really know, a little of this, that. Just say, dwell in the ambiguity. Don't look at that as some sort of intellectual handicap. It's essentially the idea that's going on here. And the self. Against Descartes, Nietzsche claims there is no self, quote unquote self, understood as a self encapsulated consciousness that's the center of experience or action, like the little camera inside of you that's taking everything in, and that's yourself. Rather, consciousness first arises as a result of the need for cooperation with others, he says. For that purpose, language comes into existence as a means of exchange. Hence, consciousness is essentially utilitarian, pragmatic, and linguistic. And the conscious self, therefore, is merely the lowest common denominator of the everyday social world. Interesting perspective on consciousness, too. And then the Ubermench, or the Superman. Your true nature lies, not concealed deep within you, but immeasurably high above you, or at least above that which you usually take yourself to be. And he said this in Schopenhauer's Educator. So Nietzsche envisions a society more exciting and more civilized than our own, a society led by dynamic individuals rather than a herd of sheep. And the members of this society, he calls them Ubermenschen, or the overman. And their dominant characteristics are self-overcoming, self-mastery, and self-definition. In other words, not other overcoming, right? Holding others down, having power over others, having power over self, mastering self-definition, right? As opposed to defining yourself through others and only through others. Let's put it that way. So the Ubermensch is not the figure of this completely self-interested individual who looks out for himself over others in the social, political, and economic spheres, like you might if you've read Ayn Rand or read Atlas Shrugged, right? That's not what the Ubermensch is. The Ubermensch detaches himself from this sort of rationality, which he says is dependent upon others. So the Ubermensch is something far even beyond what it's possible for most people to envision at this time, for lack of a better way to explain it. But this much is clear. In order to clear the way for this new society, Judeo-Christian morality must be overthrown, he said. These are Nietzsche's words, not necessarily mine. Again, we're studying Nietzsche, not Jessica. Couldn't, that joke failed. All right, everybody. Once again, as a quick reminder, This was a big collection of Nietzsche's ideas. It wasn't supposed to be breaking down one single piece where every idea flows into the next. And that's hardly even possible with Nietzsche's work at all, period. It was a big, sample platter of Nietzsche's big ideas.